Chapter 10. Shucks, this can't be Blue Stem at all. Thus Sam Sloane, gazing about, voiced his disappointment. You got your ropes there tangled, Stevens. We'll have to hunt farther than this for any line on Galloway worth having. Pat weighed his reply without haste. It did seem a queer setup, far different from anything he'd expected, but he had no idea whatsoever of giving up. We'll go on further, but not looking for Blue Stem, he said with quiet firmness. Like it or not, Sam, this is the place we're looking for. No mistake about it being bears aboard either. Our next move is to look for an explanation. Sloane grumbled, if Ezra did succeed in holding his peace. Neither tendered any active objection to riding down into the valley for a lookabout, idle as it seemed. It was at first not greatly different from wandering into a prehistoric, uninhabited world. Even the black rock ledges which broke the long rolling sweeps of grey sage wearing a most desolate look. Blue quail flushed out of the brush, and running more often than flying, a lizard would dart here and there over the sun-blazing rocks, and a mile in the sky, an eagle swam in lazy circles. Pat noted Ezra glancing about the coveys of quail in some perplexity. Well, what about it, Ez? The lanky tracker shrugged. Well, maybe nothing, he allowed. But them birds, commonest among cattle, been using the range. He went on studying the weathered ground, and after a few minutes later grumbled triumphantly. I thought so. Here's some old cow tracks, Pat. Can't be more than a season old, and likely less than that. While the others had their look, he traced out further evidence of stock grazing. Manifestly, cattle in considerable numbers had gathered on this range at one time or another. Well, let's just trace the direction of movement along the valley. Must be some point where these wandering trails that run up together. Maybe that'll tell us something. Early afternoon saw them working into a main trail. Here the furrowed lines of extensive travel gave testimony to considerable stock movement over a period of time, and some of it fairly recent. Danged if it don't look, began Sam. Ezra broke in on his words to point towards a pile of rocks, half concealed in a coulee, about which three lingering some faint appearance of design. Hey, that there's a rock hut, Sam took up, peering. Must be intended for rough weather use, but not much else. Let's take us a look-see. They found it to be in little more than a rough-made makeshift bear den, mouldy and rat-infested with its roof sawed. Dried brush shakedowns lay in the sagging bunks, unused for weeks, and a leather shoe heel or one or two rusted cans they laid about. Well, that cooks it. This is a station on the Outlaw Trail, Stevens. I thought as much when I seen that trail, but now there's no mistaking it. Pat stepped outside, glanced away over the hazing sage swells and slopes of delicate conglebine. It might explain why Blue Stem's never been constantly ranched. One range in 1,000, but a little too handy for the lone wolves. And just what do you make of Mace Galloway having interests in this country, Stevens? Ezra demanded shrewdly. Pat's grin turned wire. Well, it hasn't escaped me that those interests might, just possibly, have some close connection with that wild bunch. It's plain that Mace is not running any feeders out here, and we'll have to look elsewhere for his outfit if he's even got one in this locality. All were aware that they were trading on pretty thin clues. It was only lawyer Coriel's say-so that the flag rancher had any present connection whatsoever with the Blue Stem Valley. The hint had seemed worthwhile tracking down, and especially after what had happened to them at Badger Pass, it still did. "What do you figure the nearest town is from here?" Ezra asked. Pat was uncertain. "Well, it could be Mesa, over there on the White River." "More like Redstone up here in the Sasquatch country," the one-eyed giant hazarded. "Mesa, it must be all of 40 miles away." "Well, you could be right, and shouldn't wonder if you are," agreed Pat, understanding at once Ezra's reasoning for asking. "Mesa, it's on the wagon trails too. Redstone, it'd be more what we're looking for." "Well, let's get going then. No telling how long you'd wait here for someone to come along," Sam put in. They set out, guiding themselves mainly by the compass of the ranges, the lofty peaks being the only certain landmarks in this outflung world. The three had visited Redstone once before, some years before, and its location was not altogether forgotten. It proved rather closer than expected to Bluestem Valley, however, being little more than a matter of 20-odd miles. The slanting rays of the great red sun sliding down into the murky west, yet letting their course when Pat said that the little back-country cow town wasn't far off. "Reckon there's any harm in showing ourselves in Redstone? Because if that should turn out to be Galloway's headquarters..." Pat got Sam's point. He had already been considering that matter. "The hope is that it'll prove to be the hangout of his bunch, of course. We won't be deliberately advertising ourselves, but we'll have to ride in there if we aim to take the place and look it over good. It'll be a case of duck if we spot anyone we know too well, and from there on, I guess we'll just have to take our chances." In the entrance of Prudence, they accordingly pulled up about a half-mile from town and waited for dusk. Gradually, the chilly evening lowered, spreading its yellow, lonely light over the range. At once, Pat said that they should push on. Redstone was only a double row of wooden structures, mainly of unpeeled logs, stretched out on a flat beyond the cottonwood clumps marking the course of Blocko Creek. Because of its isolation there, the supply stores were unusually large. They were, for the most part, closed at this hour. A sprinkling of dim lights marked the great number of saloons. "Bigger'n some burgs I've rode into. A whole lot closer to Denver, though," Ezra grunted as he looked the place over from the edge of the street. "Well, it serves a pretty widespread area in somewhat of a skimpy fashion," assented Pat. "Tough, too. I doubt there's even an accredited marshal here." "No. These merchants, they know a big share of their trade comes from up and down the Yahoo Trail. They won't risk driving that way." "Must have to stand their own chances of getting robbed occasionally, then," commented Ezra. "That happens, I expect." Pat was not giving the topic much thought. "But it is to the wild bunch's own interest to see that its renegade outlaws aren't allowed to spoil a good thing, though." After leaving their broncs on a shadowy barn, the trio walked up street. Redstone was surprisingly well populated and busy. Men glanced at them sharply in the faint light from the saloons, but they weren't accosted. They had their drink at one of the less popular bars and then continued nosing around. It appeared, however, an investigation without result, and they felt themselves pretty much against a blank wall. "Reckon we wouldn't have no luck in locating Morgan in this hive if he was here," groused Sam as they surveyed the darkened street without hope. A jangling of tinny music assailed their ears, and there was a mild hubbub of men and horses moving about. "Looks like your whole guess turned to be dead wrong, Stevens, and time-consuming to bargain." I wouldn't say so. Pat's gaze was fixed as he spoke. Take a gander over there, old boy, and see if that interests you. Glancing over his pudgy shoulder, Sam stiffened. A group of horsemen were riding down the street, closely bunched together and murmuring amongst themselves, as if perfectly confident in this remote setting. At their head, eyes turning neither right nor left, rode Pike Taggart, the gnarled flag foreman, his arms still suspended in a loose sling. Quickly moving back into the shadows, Pat and the partners watched the bold cavalcade advance. They appeared to be well known, being hailed from various points, and the raised hands and casual glances at their acknowledgment said that they were conscious of power and prestige. Well now, Ezra breathed, and a soft clatter of hoofs carried the men on by. Well, this is something. I didn't know Taggart was riding a rough-barked bunch way out here. It sure looks as if he's ready for business. We watching this? Muttering Sam guardedly, shoving away from the wall. Pat asked tensely, what would you suggest? But they had barely begun to drift down the street with a view to seeing where Taggart's outfit was heading for when Ezra sank a bony elbow into Sam's midriff with such violence and as almost to deprive the stocky little man of speech or breath. Catch that over yonder, the big redhead almost hissed, indicating the direction with a jerk of his prominent chin. Pat got a glimpse of Ray Morgan, staring after Taggart at the same time that he appeared to cling to a porch pole, next to which he stood for such cover as it afforded. A moment later he moved on, gliding through the dense shadows. Turning to his companions, Ezra laughed soundlessly. Well, we tracked down the young scoundrel. Ain't no doubt but what's on his mind, neither. If he hadn't been so concerned about Taggart, Pat assented, I don't know how he could have missed seeing us. He must have passed us inside of 10 feet and never knowed so much as suspecting it. Well, we'll just watch him for a spell anyhow, growled Sam, rubbing his ribs after Ezra's poke. But you give me another job like that, you beanpole, and I'll slug you. They pushed on, keeping Morgan's tense silhouette in sight. Taggart's crowd, it presently developed, had dismounted further up the street before a kind of tents of pavilion in a vacant park. 3 or 4 coal oil flares lit the smoky interior after a fashion. The doors they lopped back, but outside the place was gloomy and somewhat brush-cluttered. Young Morgan was taking advantage of this fact and drew close. Pat saw the tent amounted to a gambling den, evidently newly opened with a plank bar across one end. It seemed to be well patronized. Inside, Pike Taggart moved about, speaking familiar to jostling men and stopping to confer with professional gamblers, his manner one of authority. Hang it, Pat. He's running that place, muttered Sam in some surprise. Could it be for him? Or Galloway, I guess. Pat nodded. He was beginning to comprehend at last the shadowy nature of the flagged ranchers' holdings in this country, and would have liked to know more, but they prudently hung back in order to avoid stampeding Morgan, who hung around one of the doors, peeping in undeciding. Taggart, they could still see through the ropey layers of smoke, taking everything in with a masterful aplomb. At a wave of his hand, a tipsy cowboy was given the bum's rush, and the crowd laughed briefly. Taggart then turned towards the rear door, and the canvas flap swung, rustling back in place behind him, and after a delay, a tall, hard-faced man followed. Morgan saw this also. Stepping back, he melted into the shadows. Must be an office tent in the back, and Morgan's figuring on listening in. Automatically, they followed suit by circling deeper into the brush. The faint light from the street did not penetrate this far, and there was only a faint starlight to show its place. It was enough, as they cautiously proceeded, to show them a hunched form beside one wall of a smaller tent in the rear of the establishment.
"We ought to grab Morgan before he disappears," Sam whispered.
"No, not yet," Pat breathed his warning. "Let him listen for a while. He might catch on to something good." The moments dragged by while they marked time. If Morgan moved at all, it was to work closer. Then Sam had been thinking hard, was made plain by his next low-toned observation.
"We'll never be able to grab that boy where he is now. It'd be a dead giveaway with Taggart just inside. Even if he ain't trying to listen to hear nothing."
Ezra snorted softly. "Well, I'll fix that. You want him now?" He turned towards Pat. The latter hesitated. They dared not delay too long, he realized. To lose track of Ray now would be a great mistake, and he was sure to run, only conscious of detection, and perhaps surer yet were he to guess their identity. "Okay, but play it smart." Ezra proceeded by rustling the brush smartly. He had Morgan's attention almost at once, for the young fella crouched lower and seemed to be looking about. "That's it." Pat was grimly amused. "Do it again, Ezra." The brush crackled faintly. Next moment, the wiry star-crossed man responded by starting to crawl away. They were ready for him, laying in wait where he must pass, a short distance from the corner of the big tent. Ray was nothing if not cautious, proceeding a few feet at a time and then halting to test his surroundings. Pat delayed till it was too late for the other to make a dash for it, then abruptly, rising out of the brush directly in Morgan's path, he spoke guardedly. "Morgan." The thoroughly startled man scarcely reacted according to expectation. With a deep, reaching gasp, he ducked and ran straight at Pat, at the final instant dodging sideways and attempting to plunge past. Had Pat been alone, the maneuver would have succeeded. It was foiled, though, by Sam and Ezra promptly leaping on him from either side, and the three they collapsed in a heap, almost knocking Stevens off his feet. But Ray was not done yet by any means. He struggled fiercely, thrashing about in somewhat of a desperation. It was largely by long practice that the partners were able to presently subdue his wiry strength and agility and pinned him down, aided to an extent by Pat. "Get him away from here," the latter panted, glancing about them. "We don't know if we was hurt or not." They hauled Morgan towards the rear of the lot, where the brush was thicker and undisturbed. Again, Ray summoned every ounce of strength in a wild effort to break free, but it was useless. "Ray," Pat rapped out to fix his attention. "Cut it short, will you? It's me, Stevens." The words did not immediately penetrate Ray's understanding, for he continued to wrestle about, but upon their repetition, he broke off his exertions abruptly. "Huh?" There was a bafflement in his grated voice. "Stevens?" He stared hard at them. "And this is Salone and Ezra, no doubt." Little enough relief sounded in his words. "Don't matter, let me go, both of you. I don't know what you're grabbing me for, but I got no particular interest in learning. Turn me loose and be quick about it." End of chapter 10.